All right, everyone, welcome along, Consolidation 2. So last week, we looked at a few things, didn't we? Kind of the ideas of Power BI and what goes on with it. And we said, it's time to do the next bit. So I've banged on a fair bit in the past about bias. And really, one of the things that we need to do and we need to cover is actually what does bias actually mean when it comes to the idea of consolidation and growth and understanding. So let's get the first bit over with, right? The basics of bias, okay? It's experience, I've experienced, this is what's happened to me, like, which then leads to the hypothesis, well, it was like that, wasn't it? Because, and the validation, where, I'm always right. Because the main thing is, no one's going to turn around and say, oh, I'm wrong. People don't like it. So they will always want to be right. And the best way to be right is to be around people who are right as well. Yeah, that makes sense. So we have a habit of surrounding ourselves with people who agree with what we think. And that then helps with the validation, because if other people agree when I say things, it must be right because they agree as well. And the problem with all that is that whole experience, hypothesis, validation is that hypothesis step, that main step becomes problematic, doesn't it? Because you're not really fully aware or fully thinking about actually what is going on with the situation you're in. You're just kind of, well, was this? Okay. And that leads to a lot of bias. And that is the fundamental piece about bias that we need to be careful about. It's a very inward looking way of dealing with things. You are looking in at, this is me, maybe my close associates. It's very inward. You're not looking to expand your horizons to try and take data samples or points of information from a wider area. And we've shown, I think hope I've shown with the stuff we've done about South Africa, that kind of the root of bias is bad, okay? But being prepared to step beyond it can really open up a world of opportunity. So where does this all come? In terms of data, when we start talking about bias, these are kind of some of the main types of bias that you get, like recall bias. It's often called things like, I can't even remember. Boom, yeah, recall bias, which is it's where like eyewitness testimony, things like that, people, they remember things the way they think they happened as opposed to the way they did happen. And, you sit there, speak to your friends and stuff like that, and it didn't happen that way, it happened a different way. And you might not change it. But when you're talking in data terms, this happens a lot. Recall bias, selection bias, where you're not actually casting your net widely. Like you might say, oh, we want to get people to come and help to do our sample or to do our test. So you advertise in one location. That's, you've kind of targeted people who read that. That's a selection bias. Survivorship bias was, a classic example of World War II, where the US Air Force in I think it was the Pacific Theatre, but check. I might put a link down below to it. They were trying to work out how could they make their bombers better and more and survive better their raids. So they were looking at where the bullet holes were on the planes to work out, right, these are the areas we need to cover, like protect more because they've had the most damage. And somebody went, well, hang on, right? There's no holes in the cockpit windows, and there's like the engines haven't been hit. So we think it might be the other way around. That, hey, the places that aren't being hit are the places that if you get hit, you ain't coming back. Right? And things like that. Observer bias, the very act of observing something can change it. If you're observing something, you could be interfering with the natural process that you're trying to manage or monitor or do anything, evaluate. It's important. Omitted variables, where we haven't fully understood the actual concept of what's going on and we haven't actually unpicked everything. And it's that hidden variable that we weren't aware of that's the most critical one. And then lastly, off on its own, it is almost the most critical, sponsorship. So where, frankly, I'm sponsored by Coca-Cola to find out which cola brand is the best. I promise you, probably won't be coming back and saying Pepsi. right? Sponsorship. So things like that are all bias, okay? And they're things that they creep into our everyday lives, and that's something you have to be aware of, you have to understand. So for me, one of the things I'm doing is I'm trying to think, okay, things happen because, why does it happen? What's happening about it? And I feel, okay? And then you want to get your mind involved, don't you? Because where is the benefit? If you're thinking, like, well, I've done this because of that, right? Well, does that person benefit from the way this is being put forward or presented? Key thing to say, and then of course, is it deliberate? Is it just something that's happened? Okay? And if you think through it, sometimes, we've all been there. Like, imagine your first date and things like that, where you want to make a good impression, and just nothing goes right. Okay, it's not deliberate. It's just like, but you've come out of it looking like a complete and utter tool, right? Just like, forget it, man. Okay, it's not being deliberate, but chances are he, she, well, they're going, I never want to see this person again. Not deliberate though, is it? It's important to kind of understand that, and that's, I think, one of those things. So the most important part that we have to understand is that you are biased, right? You are a biased person. You, okay? And the nice thing to remember is that, of course, so am I. Okay? We're all biased. There is no one out there who is not biased, right? Really and truly, there is not. Okay? It is not possible to really get through life, to be able to walk through this world without being biased. So don't sit there and say, I'm not going to be biased. That's not me. I'm not biased. I'm going to do everything. It's not going to happen. All you can do, and what we have to try and do, is to look at what we can do to think critically. Okay? The critical thought process is the most important part, in my mind, to good data analytics, good data strategy. It's an awareness that we, me, you, everybody, we are flawed. We will naturally try and find the easiest path. We will naturally try and make everything as easy as we can, as simple as we can. And what we need to be prepared to do is to say, well, let me cast me net wider, right? What's outside the comfort zone? Is it a case of saying, I'm going to read a newspaper that I wouldn't normally read for a month just to try and see if I can understand the other point of view? Is it something where you're going to go, well, I'm saying it's this way, but is it really this way? Is it something, what are you doing to step away from that internal monologue that's going on in all of us? Although apparently I heard the people who don't have an internal monologue, I don't even know how they're going through life, right? But it's about saying, what can we do? How can we research? How can we actually get into the problem and start to really unpack it and understand what's going on? And it's not about saying, I'm going to remove bias. Right? That's not something that's possible, I think. What is possible is saying, I am going to challenge my own biases. I will challenge myself to be less biased in how I deal with things and how I deal with data and how I deal with the world in general. Because once you start to tackle that and deal with I need to deal with this inside, right? From a data standpoint, you'll find naturally that as a human being, you stop being so just blinkered and biased in your biases and become more aware of what's going on with your biases. So, words to live by, maybe. So, what do you reckon then? Okay. Bias is one of those things that we all have to acknowledge. It is going to exist within us, it is part of who we are. It's not possible to turn around and say, I'm going to stop being biased. I'm going to make sure that I'm not going to do that ever again. Right? That wouldn't be an achievable outcome, and it wouldn't be a sensible thing to try and do. What we can do, though, is acknowledge our bias, acknowledge that we are, as I say, flawed, and acknowledge that I, you, we, me, all of us will do what we can do to step beyond our internal biases and really what limits us, because that is the most important part about bias, is that when you are biased, when you let your biases rule and effectively control you, and that internalization side becomes very closed in, the person who's limited the most by it, the person who's damaged the most by it, is actually you, because your horizon is limited by that. You've closed off. You've limited what you can do, what you can achieve. Once you start to engage the critical thought process and actually start to think, right, what's going on there? What, why? Huh? And that internal curiosity kicks in. Suddenly, your horizons aren't there anymore. They're kind of, where do you want to go? So, it's in everyone's interests and the benefits of all of us to really try and encourage critical thought in our friends and our colleagues and our children everywhere. And hopefully from there, we can start to think, well, how can we make this better? How can we do better here? Because that's really transcendent. So we'll do one more week, I think, maybe one, maybe two, right? More weeks. Depends how critically I think of it all going, right? Of Tubman's Tuesday. Hope you have a great week. Come back Friday for something for the weekend. Stay safe. Take care. Ta-da.